"Human, can you bury my mother before the cold takes her name?" The voice was so small Thomas Reed almost mistook it for ice tapping against the workshop door. Outside, the storm dragged frozen rain across the settlement of New Mercy, making the tin roofs hiss and the power lines hum like tired insects. The frontier planet had many kinds of weather, but this was the cruel kind, the kind that found every crack in a wall and turned it into a question of survival. Thomas stood on a ladder inside his woodshop, one hand holding a patch panel against a leaking ceiling, the other gripping a nail gun he had rebuilt twice because buying a new one cost money he preferred to spend on other people's roofs. He was 37, white, broad in the shoulders, with sawdust in his hair and old grief stored quietly behind his eyes. The knock came again. 3 taps. Soft, careful, like whoever stood outside had already learned not to ask the universe for too much. Thomas climbed down, crossed the concrete floor, and opened the door into a wall of ice rain. At first he saw only the pale light from the yard lamp shaking in the storm. Then he looked down. A child stood on his step. Alien. Small. Maybe 8 or 9 by human guess, though Thomas knew better than to trust age across species. Her skin was silver blue with a faint metallic sheen, dulled by mud and cold. Her eyes glowed softly beneath the hood of a torn cloak, bright and strange, and far too calm for a child standing alone at midnight. Both hands clutched a strip of silver cloth against her chest. Her fingers trembled, but she did not cry. That was the first thing that hurt him. Children cried when they still believed someone would come. "Please," she said, the translator disc at her throat flickering weakly. "My mother. The cold is taking her name." Thomas did not ask where she had come from. Not yet. Questions were for warm rooms. He reached behind the door, grabbed his heavy coat from the hook, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The coat nearly swallowed her. She flinched at first, then held still as if kindness were a tool she did not recognize. "Where is she?" Thomas asked. The child pointed beyond the settlement fence, toward the black ridge line where the old shuttle debris field lay half buried in snowgrass and rock. New Mercy had warned people away from that place for months. Unstable ground. Bad memories. Alien salvage rumors. Thomas took his emergency lantern, a shovel, a thermal blanket, and the battered field med kit he kept by the door. He locked nothing behind him. There was nothing in the shop worth more than the child on his step. "What is your name?" he asked as they moved into the storm. She walked beside him without taking his hand. Pride could survive inside a shaking body. "Leora Venn. I am Thomas." She nodded once, as if names were promises, and she was afraid to spend them carelessly. The walk was nearly a mile, but the storm made it feel longer. Ice gathered on Thomas's eyebrows. Mud sucked at his boots. Leora moved with the silent focus of someone who had already made this journey once and had no childhood left to waste on fear. Twice, he slowed for her. Twice, she kept going. At the edge of the ridge, the lantern caught the broken curve of a small shuttle lodged between black stones. Not burning, not smoking, just dead in the rain. Its hull peeled open like a shell the world had finished with. Under a silver thermal cloth near the sheltered side, Selah Venn lay still. Thomas stopped. He took off his cap. The storm filled the silence for him. Leora knelt beside her mother and placed the strip of silver cloth over Selah's folded hands. Beside them, half hidden under the cloth, a small organic capsule glowed with weak blue light, pulsing like a sleeping heart. "She said this was home," Leora whispered. "But I do not know how to make one." Thomas looked at the child, the mother, the cold stones, and the tiny light refusing to go out. He swallowed the ache that rose in him from an old place with his wife's laugh and his son's small work boots still stored in a box under his bed. Then he gripped the shovel. "First," he said quietly, "we give her a place to rest." The ground was frozen hard as poured concrete. Thomas drove the shovel into it anyway. The first strike barely scratched the frozen ground. The shovel rang against the dirt with a flat metallic sound that disappeared into the ice rain. Thomas adjusted his grip and struck again. Then again. Each hit sent a dull ache up his arms and into his shoulders, but he kept the rhythm steady because rhythm was what kept hard work from becoming despair. Beside him, Leora knelt near her mother under the silver thermal cloth, holding the small glowing capsule in both hands. The blue light pulsed weakly between her fingers, not bright enough to warm her, only bright enough to insist it was still alive. Thomas did not ask about it yet. He had learned a long time ago that grief brought its own order, and the living did not get to rearrange it just because they were uncomfortable. He cleared the first 2 inches of frozen crust, then the next. Mud formed under the ice and clung to the shovel blade. His coat darkened with rain. His hands went numb inside his work gloves. Leora watched every movement as if the grave were a lesson she had never wanted to learn but knew she had to remember. She said Earth humans bury their loved ones in the ground, Leora said. Her translator flickered on the word loved, stretching it into something softer. Some do, Thomas answered. Some burn candles. Some scatter ashes. Some plant trees. Depends on the family. She wanted ground. Then ground it is. Leora looked at the dark soil opening beneath his boots. Will the ground know her? Thomas stopped for half a breath. The question went through him cleanly, past the cold, past the years, straight to a small cemetery on the edge of New Mercy where 2 wooden markers leaned into the wind. His wife had loved sunflowers, though none grew well here. His son had once asked if stars could hear through dirt. Thomas had not known what to say then. He still did not. He drove the shovel down again. We will tell it who she is, he said. Leora accepted that the way children accept the only answer kind enough to stand near pain. The grave took nearly an hour. Thomas worked until steam rose from his shirt collar and his lungs burned from the cold air. When it was deep enough, he climbed out slowly, knees stiff, back protesting in the old familiar language of men who had built too many things and admitted too little. He laid his cap on the ground, then helped Leora fold the silver cloth more neatly around Selah Vin. He did not stare at the mother's face. He gave her the privacy people deserved when they could no longer ask for it. Leora placed the glowing capsule against her own chest and whispered words in a language the translator did not catch. The sounds were thin and musical, like rain on glass. Thomas bowed his head. He understood none of it. He respected all of it. Together, carefully, they lowered Selah into the earth. Leora did not cry when the first soil fell. She flinched instead, a small motion at the shoulders, like each sound landed somewhere inside her. Thomas slowed down. He placed the dirt gently, not because the dead could feel it, but because the living could. When the grave was covered, he found a piece of shuttle paneling, too bent to salvage, and used his pocket knife to scrape a smooth patch clean. Tell me her name, he said. Leora lifted her glowing eyes. Selah Vin, keeper of the eastern wind. Mother of Leora. Thomas carved slowly. His letters were not alien script, but Leora guided the sounds, correcting him with quiet seriousness whenever his hand missed the shape. By the end, the marker was rough, crooked, and real. He pressed it into the mud at the head of the grave. The storm softened for a moment, just enough that they could hear the ridge wind move through the broken shuttle. Leora stood very still, the capsule pulsing in her hands. Now I have done what she asked, she said. Thomas heard the empty space after now. The part she did not say. Now there is nothing left. He looked at her thin cloak, his too large coat around her shoulders, the way she stared at the grave as if waiting for the world to tell her where or whether she was allowed to continue. He picked up the shovel and lantern. Not quite, he said. She turned toward him. What remains? Thomas looked back toward the faint settlement lights of New Mercy, trembling beyond the rain like a promise that had not decided if it was brave enough to keep itself. You are cold, he said. That remains. Thomas did not carry Leora. He offered once, with one open hand and no pressure in his voice. But she shook her head before the translator could warm the refusal. So he walked slowly enough that she could keep her pride and fast enough that the cold did not win. The path back to New Mercy ran along the ridge and down through snowgrass that cracked under their boots. The settlement lights trembled ahead, yellow and small against the storm. 27 homes, a clinic, a supply store, a marshal post, and Thomas Reed's woodshop at the far edge where people came when a roof gave up or a door stopped closing against the wind. Leora held the glowing capsule under his coat, tight to her chest. Its blue light pulsed through the fabric like a second heartbeat. Thomas watched it from the corner of his eye. Your mother called that home? He asked. Leora nodded without looking at him. Homeseed. The word came through the translator unevenly, half language and half memory. It sleeps until safe ground. What makes ground safe? Blood, kin, warmth, walls. She paused, then added, or a first kindness from outside the line. Thomas looked at her, but she kept walking. Children said impossible things plainly. Adults were the ones who made them sound complicated. By the time they reached the settlement gate, the storm had soaked through the shoulders of his shirt and frozen the edges of his gloves. The gate camera turned toward them with a tired mechanical whir. A red quarantine light blinked once when it scanned Leora. Thomas stepped between the camera and the child. "Not tonight," he said to the machine. The machine, being cheaper than it was intelligent, kept blinking. He led her past the fence, across the muddy yard, and into the woodshop. Heat met them first. Not comfort, exactly, but the honest warmth of a stove that worked hard for a living. The shop smelled of cedar, engine oil, coffee gone bitter on a hot plate, and rain steaming off old boards. Leora stopped just inside the door. Her glowing eyes moved over the stacked lumber, hanging tools, folded tarps, spare insulation panels, and half-built cabinet frames. She stood like someone entering a temple that had forgotten it was holy. Thomas hung his wet coat near the stove and found an old wool blanket from a storage crate. "Sit close, but not too close," he said, pointing to a chair beside the heat. "Hands and feet warm slow. Hurts less that way." She obeyed with the careful stiffness of a child trying not to become trouble. He placed a mug of warm broth on the workbench beside her, then looked away so she could decide whether accepting it cost too much. After a moment, small fingers wrapped around the mug. The home seed rested in her lap, pulsing faintly beneath the blanket. Its glow brightened near the stove. Thin silver lines unfolded across its surface like roots remembering rain. Leora inhaled sharply. Thomas crouched a few feet away. "Is that good?" "It hears warmth," she whispered. "My mother said it would not wake for fear." Thomas glanced around his shop. A roof patch dripping into a bucket. A wall of mismatched lumber. A stove that clicked every few seconds because he had never replaced the left side valve. Not much of a sanctuary. Still, the home seed glowed. That made his throat tighten in a way he did not appreciate. Outside, tires hissed through mud. A truck stopped in the yard. Blue marshal lights washed across the shop windows, slow and cold. Leora's hands closed around the capsule. The silver lines dimmed at once. Thomas stood before the knock came. Marshal Grant Harlan did not wait for permission to open the door. He stepped in wearing a dark raincoat, gray beard wet, badge light blinking at his chest. His eyes went to Leora, then to Thomas, then to the alien capsule in her lap. "Tom," he said, voice heavy with law and weather. "Tell me that is not an unregistered alien miner in your shop." Thomas picked up a towel and wiped mud from the shovel handle. "All right," he said. "It is not." Harlan's jaw tightened. "This is not a joke." "No," Thomas said, looking at the child by the stove. "It is not." Marshal Harlan stood just inside the shop door, bringing the storm in with him. Rainwater ran from the brim of his hat and tapped onto the concrete floor in steady drops. His badge light blinked blue against the dark coat, bright enough to make the tools on the wall flash cold. Leora drew the blanket tighter around herself. The home seed dimmed in her lap until its glow was barely more than an ember. Thomas noticed. Harlan noticed too, but he looked at the blinking quarantine tag on his wrist display instead. That was the problem with men who trusted rules too much. They sometimes preferred screens because screens did not look back with frightened eyes. "Protocol is clear," Harlan said. "Unregistered off-world miners go to the quarantine station until identity, exposure, and custody status are verified." Thomas folded the towel once, slowly, and set it beside the sink. "She buried her mother an hour ago." Harlan's face tightened. Not enough to be mercy. Enough to prove he still had the machinery for it somewhere inside. "I am sorry for that." "She heard you." The marshal glanced at Leora. "I am sorry for your loss." Leora did not answer. Her translator disc flickered weakly at her throat. She looked down at the home seed as if apology were another kind of weather. Cold, passing, unable to build shelter. Harlan cleared his throat. "The station is heated. She will be fed. A medical officer will examine her in the morning." "Behind a locked door?" "Behind a safe door." Thomas looked at the child's hands, the way they tightened at the word locked though the translator had softened it. Funny how often those look the same from the outside. Harlan stepped farther into the shop. "Tom, do not make this difficult." "Grant." She walked nearly a mile through ice rain to ask for a grave. "Difficult got here before you did." The marshal lowered his voice. "People are scared. We do not know why that shuttle came down. We do not know if there are more of them. We do not know what that thing in her lap is. The home seed gave one faint blue pulse, like it had heard itself become a thing. Thomas felt his jaw set. He had heard that tone in mining boardrooms after the collapse, when executives called families liability groups and dead workers incident volume. Language could make a coffin out of anything. It is called a home seed, he said. Harlan blinked. And that means what? Leora answered before Thomas could. It is what mothers carry when roads are not safe. Her voice was small, but not weak. It remembers warmth. It grows walls if the ground accepts me. Harlan stared at her, then at Thomas. That is exactly why she needs examination. No, Thomas said. That is exactly why she needs warmth. Harlan rubbed one hand over his wet beard, tiredness showing through the uniform. You know I cannot just leave an alien child here, because you feel responsible. Thomas looked around the shop, the stacked lumber against the west wall, the spare insulation sheets, the old window frames salvaged from the schoolhouse, the small iron stove clicking unevenly near the workbench. He had built homes for miners, teachers, widows, stubborn old men who paid in canned peaches, and couples who argued over window height like that was the worst thing the universe would ever ask of them. Once, he had built a yellow room for a boy who never got to sleep in it. He still remembered the paint under his fingernails. He still remembered closing the door after the funeral because the room had become louder empty than full. He turned back to Harlan. I do not feel responsible. Harlan frowned. Then what is this? Thomas walked to the lumber rack and pulled down 2 straight boards of local pine wood, each 8 feet long, dry enough to take nails cleanly. The smell rose sharp and honest. This is me being available. The marshal stared. For what? Thomas set the boards on the sawhorses. Safe ground. Leora lifted her head. The home seed brightened by one careful shade. Harlan sighed. Tom, your law says she cannot wander unregistered. Thomas measured the first board with a pencil tucked behind his ear. Fine. She will not wander. That is not what I meant. Your law says she needs shelter before review. Temporary holding. Shelter, Thomas repeated. The word landed heavier the second time. He looked at the marshal, not angry, not pleading. Just immovable in the way a foundation was immovable after the concrete set. Does your law know what to do with a child who has nowhere warm to put her grief? Harlan opened his mouth. No answer came out. The storm filled the gap. Thomas picked up the saw. The blade hummed awake, clean and bright under the shop lights. Leora stood from the chair, still wrapped in his coat, the home seed glowing between her small hands. Mr. Thomas, she said, careful with the human shape of his name. My mother said home cannot be forced. He lowered the saw before cutting. Then we will not force it. It must be offered. Thomas looked at the boards, the stove, the dark corner beside his workshop where an old storage room stood unused and drafty but solid. Then I offer the first wall. The home seed answered with light. Thomas cut the first board while the storm pressed its cold face against the windows. The saw's hum filled the shop, steady and practical, and Leora watched from beside the stove with the home seed cupped in both hands. Marshal Harlan remained near the door, wet coat dripping onto the concrete, caught between the law in his wrist display and the child breathing warmth back into a thing her mother had protected through the last mile of her life. Thomas measured twice, marked once, and cut without hurry. Hurry made crooked walls. Crooked walls made bad nights. He carried the board to the old storage room attached to the east side of the shop, a narrow space he had meant to fix for years and avoided for reasons he never said out loud. It had one small window facing the ridge, a cracked interior wall, a floor that dipped near the corner, and enough drafts to make a candle nervous. It was not a home. Not yet. But it had bones. Thomas understood bones. This room? Leora asked from the doorway. Her voice tried to stay calm, but hope made it unsteady. This room, Thomas said. If you want it. She looked down at the home seat. The blue light inside it moved like a tide under glass. I do not know how to want a room. Thomas set the board against the wall and reached for his level. That is all right. Rooms can wait while people learn. Harlan stepped closer, lowering his voice. Tom, this does not solve registration. No, Thomas checked the level bubble. But it solves tonight. The council will ask why I allowed this. Tell them you found a child and a carpenter in the same building and decided to observe a cultural event. Harlan gave him a tired look. You are impossible. Only after midnight. Leora stood very still as Thomas cleared the storage room. Old crates came out first, then broken chair legs, paint cans, folded tarps, a box of brass hinges, and one small wooden horse with a missing wheel. Thomas paused when he saw it. The horse had belonged to his son, Jacob. The missing wheel had been on his workbench for 6 years. He had always planned to fix it and never had, because some repairs were too small to survive the size of what they remembered. Leora noticed the change in him, but did not ask. That was another kind of kindness. Thomas placed the wooden horse on the shelf by the window instead of hiding it again. Then he got back to work. He sealed the cracked wall with foam and pine, laid insulation beneath the floor gap, fitted the old schoolhouse window into the frame, and mounted a little heat vent from spare ductwork. His hands moved from memory. Measure, cut, fit, fasten, check. Again. Leora held boards when he asked. Harlan held a flashlight without being asked. After a while, the marshal removed his hat and stopped looking at his wrist display. The room changed by inches. Drafts quieted. The floor steadied. The stove heat began to reach the far wall. The home seed grew brighter with every nail Thomas set, not flashing, not dramatic, just answering the shape of shelter as if each board taught it a new word. Near 3 in the morning, Thomas knelt in the center of the room and cut a small square into the floor. Leora, he said gently, where does it go? She came forward with the home seed held close. Its light painted her silver blue skin with soft moving lines. Mother said under the first safe place. Thomas sat back on his heels. Then you choose. She looked around the room. The sealed wall, the little window facing the ridge, the stove glow reaching the doorway, the marshal standing silent with the flashlight lowered, the human builder with sawdust on his sleeves and grief he never used as a weapon. Leora knelt and placed the home seed into the opening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Thomas took the first board he had cut and laid it across the floor beside the seed, not covering it, just anchoring the edge of the space. Offered, he said. The home seed opened. Blue-silver light unfolded through the floor in thin root-like lines, warm but not hot, moving under the boards, up the wall studs, around the window frame. The room exhaled. The air softened. The old storage room, which had spent years holding forgotten things, began learning how to hold a child. Harlan whispered something Thomas did not catch. Leora reached one hand toward the glowing wall and stopped before touching it. It remembers her, she said. In the new light, faint symbols appeared near the window, delicate and shifting, like handwriting made from stars. Thomas could not read them, but he knew a mother's care when he saw it building itself into the walls. By the time the eastern sky turned gray, the storage room was no longer only a storage room. It had a door that closed without scraping, a window facing the ridge, a floor warm enough for bare feet, and blue-silver lines moving gently through the walls like quiet rivers of light. Thomas sat on an overturned crate near the threshold, sleeves rolled up, knuckles scraped from honest work, sawdust stuck to the rain drying in his hair. Leora had fallen asleep in the room an hour before dawn, curled under 2 wool blankets on a narrow cot Thomas had built from spare pine and an old mattress from the clinic supply closet that Harlan had somehow found without explaining where permission ended and borrowing began. The home seed kept glowing beneath the floor, not bright enough to wake her, only bright enough to keep the cold from entering. Every few minutes, faint alien symbols appeared near the window, then faded. Thomas watched them the way a man watches a fire after a hard night, not understanding the language, but understanding why it mattered. Marshal Harlan stood beside him with 2 mugs of coffee, his coat finally dry, his badge light turned off for the first time since he arrived. He handed 1 mug to Thomas. The council opens in 2 hours, Harlan said. Thomas accepted the coffee and let the heat sting his palms. That long. Do not make me regret being quiet. I would never. Harlan looked through the doorway at the sleeping child. His face had changed during the night. Not softened exactly. Weathered in a different direction. They will still ask for quarantine review. I figured. They will ask why I allowed an unregistered alien minor to remain outside holding. You can tell them the truth. Harlan gave him a sideways look. Which part? Thomas watched Leora shift under the blanket, one small hand resting on the floor above the home seed, as if she had fallen asleep listening to it breathe. That the law arrived and found a child already in a home. The marshal said nothing for a while. Outside, the storm had stopped. Meltwater dripped from the roof in slow, even taps. New Mercy began waking in pieces. A generator coughing to life, a dog barking once, boots on wet steps, the distant clinic bell marking first shift. The world had survived the night and seemed almost embarrassed by how close it had come to failing one child. Harlan set his mug down. Thomas knew that tone. It was the tone people used before saying something they had delayed too long. What? You built this because of Jacob. The name entered the room quietly and still struck every wall. Thomas did not look at him. He looked at the little wooden horse on the shelf by the window, one wheel still missing, catching blue light along its carved back. For 6 years, people in town had walked carefully around his son's name like it was a loose board over a deep hole. Harlan had stepped on it because mourning sometimes made men honest. Thomas took a sip of coffee. It had gone bitter. No, he said. Harlan waited. Thomas rubbed his thumb along a scrape on the mug handle. I know what losing a child sounds like after the house goes quiet. But I did not build this for my grief. He looked at Leora. I built it because her mother did not get her through that storm just so a locked room could finish raising her. Harlan's jaw worked once, then settled. He nodded, slow and reluctant, as if the answer had fixed something he had not known was crooked. A soft chime came from the floor. Leora stirred. The blue-silver lines brightened around the window, gathering into symbols that reshaped themselves until the translator disc on the cot flickered awake. A voice filled the small room. Gentle, faint. A woman's voice preserved in the seed, not as a ghost, not as magic, but as memory carried by living design. If someone builds the first wall for you, child, it said, build the rest of your life inside it. Leora opened her eyes. She did not cry, not at first. She placed her palm flat on the warm floor, and the room answered with light. The voice from the home seed faded slowly, leaving the room warmer than before. Leora sat on the edge of the narrow cot with both hands pressed to the floor, her silver-blue skin glowing softly in the living light beneath the boards. For a long moment, nobody moved. Thomas stood in the doorway holding a mug of bitter coffee that had gone cold in his hands. Marshal Harlan looked at the wall as if the law might be hiding somewhere in the blue-silver lines, embarrassed by what it had failed to understand. Leora finally looked up. Her luminous eyes were wet now, but steady. She knew someone would help. Thomas set the mug down. I think she hoped someone would. Hope is not knowing. No, he said. It is building anyway. The home around them answered with a soft pulse, and the small window cleared itself of fog. Beyond it, the ridge waited under a pale morning sky. Selavin's grave was barely visible from the room, just a dark marker against the thawing snowgrass, but Leora saw it at once. Her hand tightened against the floor. She can see the wall. Thomas did not correct her. Some truths were not improved by being made smaller. Outside, voices gathered in the yard. First one, then 3, then more. Boots on wet gravel. A truck door closing. The settlement had noticed the blue light through the shop windows, because frontier towns noticed anything that might become trouble before breakfast. Harlan stepped to the door and opened it before anyone knocked. Cold air rolled in, carrying the smell of rain, mud, and people trying to sound brave in groups. Mrs. Keller from the clinic stood at the front with a medical bag. Behind her were 2 council members, the schoolteacher, the supply store owner, and half a dozen neighbors pretending they had come for official reasons instead of curiosity. Their eyes went past Harlan, past Thomas, straight to Leora sitting in the small room that had not existed yesterday. The home seed brightened under her hands. The living walls responded, not defensively, not loudly, just enough to show the room had chosen her back. One of the council members swallowed. Marshal, we have quarantine protocol. Harlan looked tired enough to tell the truth. I am aware. Then why is the child still here? Thomas expected Harlan to cite emergency discretion, thermal instability, custody pending review, all the hard little phrases people used when kindness needed paperwork to survive. Instead, the marshal stepped aside so they could see the room clearly. The cot, the sealed walls, the warm floor, the alien symbols near the window, the small wooden horse on the shelf, and Leora sitting upright with Thomas's old blanket around her shoulders. Because by the time I got here, Harlan said, she had asked for a grave, and he was building her a home. The yard went silent. Mrs. Keller's face changed first. She had delivered half the settlement's children and buried too many minors to pretend she did not understand the difference. She walked past the council member, entered the shop slowly, and set her medical bag on the workbench. "May I check your temperature, sweetheart?" Leora looked at Thomas. He nodded once, but did not answer for her. After a moment, Leora said, "Yes." The word was small. The room brightened anyway. The schoolteacher came next, holding a bundle of folded quilts. The supply store owner left a box of canned soup near the stove. Someone placed a pair of dry boots by the threshold, far too big for Leora, but offered with the awkward sincerity of people learning in public. The council members stared at the living walls, then at Harlan. "This does not erase the law." "No," Harlan said. "It shows us where the law stopped too soon." Thomas looked away before anyone could make him into the center of it. He found the loose hinge on the new door and tightened it, because that was something his hands understood. Behind him, Leora touched the wall beneath her mother's glowing words, and the house answered with warmth, as if the first morning of her new life had finally found a place to enter. By mid-morning, the small room beside Thomas Reed's woodshop had become the warmest place in New Mercy. Not because the stove burned hotter there, though it did, and not because the blue-silver lines in the walls carried alien heat through the pine boards, though they did that too. It was warm because people kept stepping inside and leaving something of themselves behind. Mrs. Keller taped a clinic tag near the cot that read voluntary home observation, then underlined voluntary twice. The schoolteacher brought a stack of beginner readers and set them below the window, asking Leora which language she preferred to learn first. The supply store owner returned with a smaller pair of boots and pretended they had always been lying around in the back. Even old Mr. Dawes, who complained about everything from water pressure to sunrise direction, left a jar of honey on the workbench and said it was for immune support, not sentiment. Leora watched all of it from the doorway of her new room, wrapped in Thomas's blanket, her luminous eyes moving from face to face with careful disbelief. The homeseed responded to each gift differently. The quilts made the wall glow soft near the cot. The books stirred faint symbols around the shelf. The boots warmed near the threshold until the mud on their soles dried into harmless dust. When Mrs. Keller touched Leora's wrist with a scanner, the living floor brightened under both of them, as if approval in that room was not a signature but a pulse. Thomas stayed busy where he could avoid being thanked. He fixed the door hinge, adjusted the heat vent, planed a rough edge off the window frame, and finally sat at the workbench with the little wooden horse in front of him. The missing will lay in a parts tray, exactly where it had waited for 6 years. He picked it up. His fingers remembered Jacob handing him the toy one summer afternoon, asking if horses needed shoes and space. Thomas had told him only if they were going somewhere important. Now the wheel turned between his thumb and forefinger, small and unfinished, asking a question he had avoided longer than any roof leak. Leora came to stand beside the bench. She did not touch the toy. She only looked at it. Was it his? Thomas kept his eyes on the wheel. "Yes." "Your child?" "Yes." The word came out rough, but it came out. Leora nodded as if the house had told her first, and she was only being polite by asking. "My mother said grief is a room with no door until someone brings light." Thomas fitted the wheel into place and tightened the tiny peg. "Your mother sounds like she knew construction. She knew leaving." That made him stop. Outside, Marshal Harlan stood with the council members beside his truck, speaking in low voices. The quarantine order still existed. The council still had forms. Fear had not vanished because one wall glowed. But something had shifted. People had seen Leora as a child before they could file her as a risk, and that order of seeing mattered. Harlan entered the shop alone a few minutes later, holding his wrist display flat in one hand. "Emergency settlement review," he said. "Temporary guardian status, pending off-world kin search, home observation authorized, quarantine waived unless medical risk appears." Thomas looked at him. "You put all that in before noon?" Harlan shrugged. Mrs. Keller threatened to bring muffins to the council chamber until they listened. Terrifying woman. Effective woman. Leora stepped closer, still holding the blanket around her shoulders. "Does this mean I stay?" Harlan lowered himself to one knee, not as ceremony. Only so he did not tower over her. "It means you stay while we help find what is best for you. And no one takes you from this room tonight." The homeseed answered with a slow wave of light across the floor. Leora looked at Thomas. He held out the wooden horse, now with 4 working wheels. "For the shelf," he said. "If you want it." She accepted it with both hands. as carefully as she had carried her mother's seed through the storm. She placed it beneath the window facing the ridge, beside the glowing symbols Selah had left behind. The house brightened around the toy, around the books, around the boots, around the borrowed quilts, weaving all of it into the first language of belonging. Thomas watched the light move and understood, with a quiet ache, that a home was not built when the walls went up. It was built when someone small finally believed the door would open from the inside. That night, New Mercy did something it had never done before. It left a porch light on for someone who had arrived from the dark. The storm was gone, and the settlement rested under a clean black sky, filled with hard white stars. Meltwater dripped from the roofs. Generators hummed behind the houses. Far beyond the fence, the ridge held Selah Vin's grave in quiet shadow, and from the small window beside Thomas Reed's woodshop, Leora could see the marker whenever she wanted to remember where the night had ended and the morning had begun. She stood inside her room with bare feet on the warm floor, Thomas's blanket around her shoulders, and the wooden horse on the shelf beneath her mother's glowing words. The home seed had grown through the walls in thin blue-silver veins, not taking over the wood, not hiding the nails, but joining them. Human pine and alien memory. Sawdust and starlight. A room offered by one species and accepted by another. Thomas stood in the doorway with a screwdriver in his hand, adjusting the latch for the third time because it still clicked too loudly when the wind shifted. Leora watched him with solemn patience. "The door already closes," she said. "Yes," Thomas answered, "but it can close better. You fix things that are not broken." He paused, then looked at the latch. "Sometimes I fix things before they get lonely enough to break." She seemed to think about that. Children on frontier worlds became philosophers too early. Outside, soft footsteps approached. Marshal Harlan stopped at the porch and set a paper folder on the workbench, then raised both hands when Thomas looked over. "No trouble," he said. "Temporary guardianship papers. Mrs. Keller made me bring them before she brought muffins." Thomas picked up the folder but did not open it. "You staying for coffee?" Harlan glanced at Leora's room, at the soft living light, at the child standing in a place the law had not known how to imagine 12 hours earlier. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight should belong to the house." He left without making his boots sound official. Leora came to the doorway after him. "What is guardianship?" Thomas set the folder down slowly. "It means adults write down who is responsible while everyone figures out what comes next." "Are you responsible?" The question was not fearful. That made it harder. Thomas looked at the small room, the repaired toy, the quilts, the books, the warm floor, the mother's words shining faintly above the shelf. Then he looked at Leora. "I am here," he said. "That is what I can promise tonight." She accepted that more easily than grander words. Maybe because she had already lost enough to know the value of one honest night. After a while, she walked to the window and looked toward the ridge. "Did you build this because you lost your child?" Thomas stood beside the doorway, not entering unless she asked, not leaving because she had not. The question reached into him, past the years of work, past the woodshop noise, past the box under his bed where Jacob's small boots still waited for feet that would never grow. He could have said yes, and no one would have blamed him. It would have been simple. Too simple. "No," he said quietly. "I built it because your mother did not save you just so the night could keep you." Leora's hand rose to the glass. The home seed brightened around the window, and for a moment Selah's symbols glowed clear enough that even Thomas felt he could almost understand them. Not words. A blessing shaped like shelter. Leora leaned her forehead against the glass and finally cried. Not the silent kind she had carried through the storm, but the kind that comes when a child realizes someone else is holding the door. Thomas did not touch her. He only stood nearby, keeping the room warm, letting grief become sound without being taken away. Much later, when the stars shifted and the settlement slept, Leora climbed into the cot under the quilts. The house dimmed itself to a soft blue glow. Thomas checked the stove, the latch, the window, and the floor around the home seat. Everything held. At the threshold, he turned off the shop light, but left the small porch lamp burning. She had come asking for a grave. He had built the first wall of tomorrow.